Hey guys, Mitch with Shock Therapy, and today we're going to be showing you how to install the brand new BSD Pin Kit for all ball joint style tie rods. This kit is extremely adjustable in the sense of having multiple size spacers to help you guys correct most, if not all, of the bump steer in your guys' vehicles. Included in our kit is a through bolt design that's going to offer the most strength and durability. A helpful tip for you guys before even starting the installation is to set your toe on the factory tie rods to 0 at ride height. That's going to help your installation greatly. This install is extremely detailed, and we do recommend that you take your time. Please allow yourself 3 to 4 hours to complete. Let's jump on in. I'm going to show you guys how to get it done. Hey guys, so before you actually start the installation, it is super important that your first step would be to make sure that your steering wheel is perfectly straight and perfectly centered. You can do this by eyeballing it. You can also take a ratchet strap and tie it around the steering wheel to the A-pillars of the cage. Just important to make sure that the steering wheel stays straight the entire installation. Measure the factory toe. This is done by taking the measurement from the inside of the front tire with a tape measure butted up to the sidewall. Next, take the same measurement on the back side of the front tires by butting the tape measure up against the sidewall. With your factory numbers measured at ride height, it's always a good idea to write them down on paper so you can see the difference from the front measurement versus the rear measurement. Our goal right now from the factory setting is to get it at 0, so when we jack the car up, we're going to be able to read our bump steer number more easily. In this case, we had 45 inches in the front, and we had 45.5 inches in the rear. That means we are a ½ inch toed in at ride height. Next, loosen the factory jam nut on the tie rod. Make sure that you loosen both sides so you can adjust them equally. With our factory jam nuts on the factory tie rods loosened up, we can now begin to set our ride height at 0 toe. So basically, if you look back at your notes, you're going to notice that you're a ½ inch toed in. Our goal is to adjust both sides of the tires equally to where the front measurement becomes the same as the rear measurement, resulting in 0 toe at ride height. Next, adjust both tie rods equally until the front of the tire begins to move outward, achieving your 0 toe at ride height. Retake your measurements from the inside of the front tire as well as the inside of the rear front tires to make sure that your ride height toe measurement is set to 0. After adjusting the factory tie rods, we have achieved a 45.25 in the front and a 45.25 in the rear, resulting us in 0 toe at ride height. Your following step would be to hand tighten the jam nuts on the factory tie rod and then jack the vehicle up to full droop. Make sure that you finger tighten both of the jam nuts on both tie rods before jacking up the vehicle to full droop. Next, jack the vehicle up until both front tires are off of the ground. Make sure to use jack stands for safety. With the vehicle at full droop, you can now take the same measurement on the front and rear of the front tires. After getting your measurement at full droop, we're going to review our numbers and notice that we were 40 inches in the front and 41.5 inches in the rear, resulting us an 1.5 inches toed in at full droop. What we're going to do now is refer to the BSD Pin Kit chart and look at the top graph to determine what our spacer thickness needs to be and then reference our starting point and go from there. Now, want to point something out to you guys that the correct way to do your bump steer measurements would be going from ride height to full droop to fully compressed. We understand that you guys aren't going to want to take shocks off at home, so we're giving you guys kind of a cheater way to figure out what the factory bump steer number is, and then refer to our chart to determine what spacer thickness that you guys need to use. With the factory bump steer number determined, you can now begin removing the passenger side wheel and tire. Next, remove the factory nut holding the factory style ball joint tie rod to the spindle. This is done by using an 18mm wrench. Remove the tie rod from the spindle and then remove the factory clamp holding the boot onto the steering rack. Make sure to move the boot back far enough to where you can get a wrench onto the inner ball joint to loosen the tie rod off of the steering rack. Remove the tie rod from the steering rack. Next, separate the two pieces of the factory tie rod, remove the jam nut, and remove the factory boot. Next, install some blue Loctite onto the inner joint and install the inner joint into the factory rack. With the inner joint attached to the factory steering rack, you can now tighten it down using an adjustable wrench. Next, install the factory boot onto the shock therapy tie rod. Install the tie rod onto the inner joint, followed by the left-hand rod end on the spindle side. Make sure when installing the tie rod and joints to bottom both sides out to where your adjustments on both sides will be equal. Next, install the unibit into a drill and begin drilling out the spindle. After you guys drill the spindle out the initial time, it is smart to take the pin, see if it fits in there. If it stops, just take the drill bit, drill it out a little bit more until the pin slides in there nice and freely. With the spindle drilled and the pin able to slide in, you're now going to refer to the BSD Pin Kit chart that was either shipped to you with the pin kit or displayed on the screen here. Also, with the charts that we're going to display on this screen for you guys is a very generic starting point. That does not mean that it's going to be perfect for every single make and model because they are different. In this case here, we're going to be starting at 450 thousandths total spacer height. If you look at the chart, you can reference to your make and model and the starting point and the spacer thickness. Install the supplied spacers onto the pin kit, referring to the guide, and install the pin into the spindle. Next, install the rod end onto the pin, followed by the top spacer and the bolt going through the whole system. Pro tip for you guys, when you're installing the bottom spacers underneath the spindle, always have the smaller thickness size spacer against the spindle so that the washer of the nut and the bolt have a more solid clamping force on the thicker side of the spacer. Okay guys, so in the kit, you're going to receive a jam nut. This is a 1/2 inch jam nut, and you're also going to receive a 1/2 inch pinch nut. The pinch nut is going to be for the final assembly of the tie rod after you have finished cycling the car and correcting the bump steer. The jam nut is only intended for if you have to pull the pin back out of the spindle and move your spacers around. This does not stay on the car after the final installation. Install the remaining spacers on the bottom side of the spindle, followed by the washer, and then followed by the supplied jam nut, only used for cycling purpose. Make sure to finger tighten the jam nut to where there is no play in the system. With the pin kit installed, you can now reinstall the factory wheel and tire and repeat these steps on the opposite side. With the pin kit installed on both sides, you can now lower the vehicle back to the ground. Making sure that your steering wheel is still centered and straight, you can begin adjusting each tie rod equally to where you are eyeballing the front tire to the rear, getting it as close to straight as possible. Make sure that you do both sides equally so your tie rod length on driver's side and passenger side remain the same. Take a step back and eyeball the front tire to the rear tire, making sure that it is as straight as possible. When that is achieved, you can now settle the suspension by driving the vehicle back and forth a couple times to make sure that your ride height points are the same. Next, take your ride height toe measurements by measuring both front and back side of both front tires. Now that we have the BSD Pin Kit installed with the starting point measurements, what we're going to do is get the car back to 0 at ride height for our starting point. Once that's achieved, we're going to jack it up to full droop and check our measurement there. With 0 toe at ride height achieved with the Pin Kit installed, you can now jack up the front of the vehicle till both tires are off the ground. Repeat the toe measurements with the vehicle jacked up at full droop and document your numbers. Okay guys, so we got our measurement from full droop. We are sitting at 40 1/4 in the front and 40 1/2 in the rear, which in return is 1/4 inch of bump steer from ride height to full droop. Now, if you were to full cycle that the correct way, this is the cheat way, the easier way around it for you guys, you'd be sitting at about 1/2 inch of bump steer, which is pretty good. Now, the goal is to get as close to 0 as possible. So a little trick for you guys is when you're cycling this, if you go from ride height to full droop, if the pin is too tall, that's basically going to tow the tire out at full droop and tow the tire in at fully compressed. You can always refer back to the pin chart to kind of reference what numbers or what spacers you're going to be using. But anywhere in that 1/4 to 1/2 inch range is pretty good for these cars, considering we were at almost 3 inches of bump steer from the factory. Once you guys get to as close to 0 as you possibly can, you can now remove both the tires, remove that jam nut, and install the pinch nut, making sure that you torque it to 110 foot-pounds. Remove the passenger front wheel and tire, and remove the jam nut off the bottom of the pin, making sure that you reinstall the pinch nut, tightening it down and torquing it to 110 foot-pounds. With the pinch nut torqued down to 110 foot-pounds, you can now reinstall the factory wheel and tire, making sure that you torque down the lug nuts to manufacturer spec. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. With the pin kit completely installed, you can now lower the vehicle back to the ground, making sure that the steering wheel is still centered and straight to begin setting your 1/4 inch towed in measurement at ride height. Retake your toe measurements at ride height and begin adjusting your tie rods until you achieve a 1/4 inch towed in at ride height. To achieve a 1/4 inch towed in at ride height, make sure that you adjust both tie rods from driver and passenger side evenly so that the tie rods stay the same length. Retake your measurement until you achieve a 1/4 inch towed in. You can now begin locking down the jam nuts holding the tie rod to the inner joint. Make sure that you use blue Loctite and tighten down the jam nut using a 15/16 wrench. Next, tighten down the spindle side jam nut to the tie rod, again using blue Loctite and a 15/16 wrench. With both jam nuts tightened, you can now reinstall the factory boot onto the factory steering rack using zip ties to hold the boot in place. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. And your installation is complete. We hope that this video helped you guys with the installation of your BSD Pin Kit at home. A couple things to keep in mind. Make sure that when you are setting up the vehicle that your steering wheel is always going to be centered anytime that you adjust the pin kit. One thing to keep in mind when installing this kit is that the right way to do this is to fully cycle the car. We understand you guys aren't going to do that at home or don't want to, so for the simple ease of installation, we showed you guys how to do it in this video. Our guide for this kit is just a starting point, so it is up to you guys to check the before and after to make sure that your numbers are correct. And always make sure that you don't ever surpass the numbers that we give you. Another important thing to remember is that you are settling the suspension between each cycle. Our BSD Pin Kit is adapted to every other 5/8 tie rod, making it easy for you to use depending on what brand that you have. If you like this video, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified anytime that we post a new video. If you'd like to order this kit or any other products, feel free to visit the website at www.shocktherapyusa.com. For any technical help with this video or any other questions, feel free to reach out at 623-217-4959.